Well, it's another cold day here in New England. I'm going to be doing a lot of work out in the shop area here. We're going to be converting a part of this into chicken space. But it's still kind of chilly out, and I thought, this would be a good time to make a waste oil burner. As with all my projects, follow along while I collect a bunch of junk I've got laying around. What we're going to do is made up of two main parts. One is going to be the waste oil burner, and the other is going to be a stove. I'd like to design the stove so I can either use it for waste oil or for burning wood, but it's a great way to get rid of all that waste oil. If you do your own oil changes on cars, trucks, tractors, whatever you've got, if you do a lot of fried food, all that oil, you don't want to dump it down the sink, can't put it in the garbage can. It's a great way to get rid of it, and it's a free way to heat an outbuilding, and that's what we'll be doing today. So follow along. I'm going to go see what I can find for parts to make the actual burner part, and I'll explain how everything works along the way. This is going to be a completely electricity-free burner. I'm not going to be using electricity to work a blower. I want this to be completely off-grid so I can use it in any of my outbuildings. And let's see what we come up with. Well, I think I found our first two pieces. I'm going to be using an old gas bottle, and I'm going to show you, like I did on a few other videos, the proper way to empty one of these to make sure it doesn't ignite while you're trying to cut it. But I'm going to use this again as like a 4-inch pipe that's sealed at one end. And as a base, I'm going to be using this old Dutch oven stove. It's pretty rusted out. It doesn't have a lid. It was just something that we used outdoors, but it's gotten to the point now where it's garbage. But it doesn't have any holes in the bottom, and that's what I'm looking for. We'll see how this works because my welding skills are kind of crappy. And what I'm going to have to do is cut a hole in the bottom of this, big enough to slide this bottle through, but tight enough that I can weld it in and have a nice tight seal. I'll show you all of that as I go along. The problem I'm going to run into is, as a lousy welder, I've got cast iron and like a mild steel, and the two typically don't play well together. So we'll see how good of a joint I can make. All I really need to do is seal the hole so that the oil can't leak through. I'm not really doing this to be strong. It doesn't have to be a strong weld because it's not going to hold any weight. But I do need to seal it up, and we'll see how good I can do. If it doesn't work, we may have to try something other than cast iron. Well, I was able to use the plasma cutter to cut out the hole. It made fairly quick work of that. And then I used the grinder just to kind of clean up the edges where I'll be welding. But that makes for a nice snug fit for the bottle. So the next step is going to be cutting the bottle. But before I do that, I'm going to disarm this, make sure that it's not going to blow up on me. And like I showed you in a few videos before, we're going to make sure the bottle's empty. I'll show you how to do that. I'll get a little tool that I had made to remove the relief valve. Once that's removed, we'll fill the bottle with water. That'll drive any remaining gas out. Then I can dump the water out, and it'll be safe to work on from there. So let's go get that tool, and I'll show you how that's done. So here's the tool that I made. It's just an old screwdriver. It's one of those screwdrivers you get with furniture kits. So it's kind of a garbage screwdriver anyway. I cut the end off, and then I used a grinding wheel just to grind a little groove in it. But I use this to straddle the needle on that relief valve and get around the screw that's in here. Then I can just unscrew it. Okay, and once that's unscrewed, just use a pair of needle nose pliers or tweezers or whatever. Pull that pin out. It's a little spring-loaded relief valve. And by doing that, I've opened the bottle up. The bottle's completely open now. So I'm going to put water in this little hole here, and as the bottle fills, it's just going to push any gas or air that's in here out. Then I can dump the water back out. When the bottle's empty, it's safe to work on. Now before you relieve that, make sure the bottle is empty. You can always just take a pin and push it right into the end here, and listen. If it's not hissing at all, it's probably empty, and you can go ahead and take that valve out. But you don't want to do that if there's any pressure in this, because if you unscrew it, it's just going to pop, and whatever gas is in the bottle is all going to come spraying out. So make sure the bottle's empty, remove the relief valve, fill it with water, and you're going to be safe. So let's go ahead and get this cut. Once this is cut, we can move on to the next step. And to be honest, I think the next step before I actually weld these together is going to be making the stove portion of it. Because in my mind, the way I kind of have this envisioned, this is going to be the burner. The oil is going to drip into this pan. This is going to be centered here, but it's also going to stick out the bottom. That has to go through a hole that's at the bottom of the stove, and at this point I don't even have a stove yet, so I need to make sure something I can make it out of something big enough that'll fit this old Dutch oven, and I need to know how low this pipe has to be in the Dutch oven to be able to extend out of the bottom of the stove. You'll see what I'm talking about when I do it. It may be confusing now, but I'll show you how it's done. The whole point is I want this stove to run off of convection rather than using an electric blower. That way I don't need any electricity to run it, and it's still going to burn real hot. So let's go figure out what we're going to use for a stove, and then we'll move on to the next step. Well, I was going to use an old propane tank to make the stove, but I forgot all about this. This is an old pressure tank for our well that we had swapped out about 5 years ago. I saved it just in case I wanted to use it for a project, and maybe that's today. We'll find out. I'm not sure what we're going to find inside of this. I've never cut open or looked inside of a pressure tank. I know there's a big rubber bladder in here, and there's some plumbing, and there's a valve here to pressurize it. So I'm not sure what's going to be in here, whether or not it's going to work for us. The first thing we need to do though is cut what's going to be our door for opening and closing the stove. Once I get that cut, I'll be able to see what's inside the tank and whether or not it's going to work. Fingers crossed that this is going to work. I like the size. I think this would be a perfect little stove that we can move from building to building in our colder months. But we'll see how it works out. Well, I finished the first cut, and what I'm going to do now is attach 2 hinges over that cut, and then I'll finish making the rest of my cuts. But that way I'll know that the door is in the right place by securing it here. Now normally what I would probably do is weld these hinges on, but what I'm going to do I think today is use self-tapping sheet metal screws and screw these hinges on. And the reason for that is, like I said, I really don't know what I'm going to find behind here, and I don't want to do anything too permanent and then find out that it was just a big waste. So I'm going to screw the hinges on, then we'll finish cutting and see what we've got on the inside. And later on, if I decide that I want to weld these on, I can take the screws out and weld the hinges in place. But until then, let's get these drilled, pre-drilled, screwed on, and then I'll finish my cuts. Alright guys, I finally got this thing cut open and cleaned out. I'll show you what we've got. I don't know how well this is going to pick up. Do you see? There's still water in this thing. What a mess. Also, the top doesn't go all the way up to the top. So I'm going to have to see what I can do about that. Also, I had to pull all of this stuff out from inside the tank. Yeah. The next thing we need to do is I flipped it upside down. I'm going to cut a hole out in the bottom to accommodate the pipe coming out of the bottom. I'm going to use the plasma cutter again because I'm going to try to make this as neat of a hole as possible. I want it to be a fairly tight fit where that comes through. This is going to allow me to regulate how much oxygen gets in here, and if there's any air leaks around that, it's going to make it a little less in my control, and it's going to be able to suck a little extra air in. So I'm going to try to make this as neat as possible. Once we get that cut out, we'll dry fit our canister, make sure it goes all the way through our pipe, and we'll see how it turns out. Okay, we're almost done with the roughing it in stage, because this obviously, I've got to clean up these edges, I've got to deburr this. And like I said, I don't know if I'm happy with the door. It's kind of flimsy. I also would like to look at maybe putting in a glass panel so I can see what's going on in here. But like I said, we're just roughing it in right now. Here's the pan we cut with the hole in the bottom. And now we have the matched hole in the bottom here. This is going to sit inside here when it's to be used for waste oil. If I was going to burn wood in here, the hole in the bottom of the, we'll call this the stove, that'll act as an ash drop. But for waste oil, it's actually going to be what feeds the air into our system. And then this bottle here is going to pass through both the cast iron pot and the bottom of the stove. It's going to be open at this end. This is going to get cut off so air can come up through this bottle, and there'll be holes drilled around the outside edges of this so the air can come in to the inside of this pan, and that's where the oil will be coming. So convection is going to pull air up into the bottle, blast air down at the burning oil. That's what's going to feed the fire. And then we still have to come up with a chimney so that we can exhaust all of our smoke and whatnot. But once this gets burning hot, a good efficient waste oil burner doesn't really put out a whole lot of smoke, and that's what we're shooting for. So let's move on to the next step. I didn't know at what height to cut this bottle until we were at this stage, but now I know I need it to stick out below the stove about 2 inches. And I don't want the top of this much higher than the edge of our pot. So knowing that now, I can mark this up. I can cut the bottle because we've already drained it and it's safe. Once I get this bottle cut, we'll be able to permanently mount half of the bottle into the stove and the other half into our cast iron. And that's where I get to see if my welding skills are good enough to put a propane bottle on a cast iron pot. I kind of doubt it, but we'll see what happens. I got the bottle cut, and I figured out how much needed to extend out of the bottom for it to fit through. And then I cut another piece that's going to act as a collar right here to accept the pipe as it goes through. But also, if this is removed and this is going to be used is a wood stove, this still gives me this little collar right here. And what that's going to allow me to do, I decided to leave this base on here, and it has this handle for picking it up. I'm going to leave this as an access hole, and I think I'm going to put in some kind of a slide or control arm so that this collar can be either opened or closed for waste oil, or it could remain closed for wood and then opened for dumping ash out the bottom. So this is going to get welded onto the stove, and then this is what I'm fearing is going to be welded onto the cast iron. We want to make sure as oil drips into this pan, it doesn't leak between the pan and this propane cylinder. We don't want it leaking out, so that's where my weld has to be good enough to hold the oil in. So that's going to be our next step, and we'll see how well that turns out. Well, I finished all my ugly welds around the bottom. Not pretty at all, but it looks like it took. I didn't crack the cast iron, which is what I was worried about. What I did is just a series of tack welds all the way around, let it cool, little series of tack welds all the way around, let it cool. And I did that after preheating the cast iron with a torch. So I heated up the cast iron just so it wasn't so much of a shock to get welded. And then one tack, and until eventually I connected all of them. It did take quite a while, but I got it all the way around, and I just need to grind it and make it look a little prettier. Not that anybody's going to be looking at it. But the other thing that I'll be doing before we actually test this is I'm going to put a little water in this pan, and I'll let it sit for a little while and see if anything drips out. I want to make sure all those little holes are sealed up so we're not dripping oil. But if I could let this sit overnight, let's say, and it doesn't leak anything, it holds the water, then it'll hold the oil. So I won't have any fear there. But anyway, our next step is going to be drilling our air ports, holes all around this butane bottle, and that's what will be porting the air that's coming in from the bottom down towards our flames. So what I'm going to do is drill as low as I can a series of holes, and then what I'm going to try to do is get something into the hole and kind of bend it a little bit in a downward position. You'll see what I'm talking about. That way when the air comes in, it doesn't blow up, it blows down, or at least a little bit down. Just that is what's going to be feeding our fire. So let's get this drilled. That'll be that step, and then we'll move on to the next phase of the stove, which will probably be putting in the chimney. And then I have to drill a hole in the side so there's some place for the oil to come from. But that's like the second phase of the whole stove thing. So anyway, let me pick out a drill bit. We'll get this drilled and we'll see how that looks. So I decided to use a 3/8 bit, and I'm going to make 6 holes around the outside edge. I'll drill those out, and it really doesn't matter how rough these are. As long as they're spaced evenly and I have enough draw. Hopefully 6 holes is enough. If it's not, I'll either make the holes larger or I'll add additional holes between each one. Okay, so I got all my holes drilled, and what I was talking about before, I'm just going to take this punch, stick it in one of these holes, and push down. What I'm trying to do is bend the top out a little bit and the bottom in a little bit. I'm hoping that that makes the air blow in a more downward direction. I don't know if that's really going to make much of a difference, but I'm going to give it a shot, and I'm going to just do that with all 6 of these holes. Okay. And then as far as this is actually the burner, this piece here. This looks like it's all set. Really the only thing that's left to do with this piece is that oil test. You know, I'll put some water test. I'll put some water in here, let it sit overnight, and we'll see if we have any holes that need to get patched up. But aside from that, this piece is finished, and we'll move on to the stove. The next thing we need to do for the stove is, I still have that last piece of this butane bottle. What I'm going to do is cut a hole in the back of the stove using that last cut off piece, and I think that's going to get welded in, and it'll be the receiver for our chimney. Well, the next thing I think we need to do is cut a hole here in the back of the it's going to be the stove right here that we can put our chimney coming off of. So I'm going to cut a hole back here that I can get a tube in that we can use as a sleeve to attach a chimney, and let's get cutting. Okay, now that we have the hole cut out, I put that last piece of butane bottle. It's going to be our sleeve for our chimney, or at least the beginnings of the sleeve. But now that brings up another problem. I had mentioned earlier that the top of the tank on the inside doesn't come all the way to the top. That piece that I cut out is sitting right in here. It doesn't drop all the way to the bottom because it's not open. So what I'm going to need to do is cut a bigger hole right here in the top so that the smoke can easily get up to where the chimney is, and it's not such a pain to clean it out, because I'm sure a lot of soot and stuff will build up in here. I'm not going to cut the whole thing wide open. I'm going to leave some of that plate that's in there, because I think it'd be great for collecting a lot of the heat before it all escapes out of the chimney. Now that that's opened up a little bit, I could reach in and grab the piece we cut off from the back. And I'll probably smooth this up a little bit with the grinder, just in case, for whatever reason, maintenance or whatever, I have to get my hands in there. I don't want to cut myself on any rough edges. But we'll get that cleaned up a little bit. Now we have access to the top. And because of that, now the smoke can go up and out. And I wanted this hole bigger than our chimney. Not much bigger, but bigger. And I left enough of that inside pan so that the flames can hit that and increase the amount of heat that this is capturing before it all just goes right out the chimney. So we can move on to the next part. Now that we have a hole cut into the back, I'm going to use a piece of stovepipe. I'm going to weld this on, and this is going to be my receiver for the actual stovepipe itself. I'm going to be using this 4-inch pipe that I have left over from an old wood pellet stove. It'll be more than enough chimney for this, but by welding this on, I know I'm going to have a nice solid connection when I attach that chimney. The other thing I need to do is I've got to weld in some plate or strips of metal on the inside so the door has something to clap against. And like I said in the beginning, I'm not crazy about this door, so I'm probably going to do a little work on this too to beef it up a little bit. Plus we have to make a latch that closes it. And then one last thing that we need to do on this piece is put in some kind of a control unit down here so that I can control that draft. Aside from that, we just need to put a hole in the side to allow our oil to come and drip into that little burn chamber. Okay, well, I put a simple little latch on here just so I can open it, close it, latch it shut. All I did was weld a little angled piece of metal here and then take another flat piece of metal, put 2 holes in it. One of them is hinged with a screw and another one has another bolt going through it, and I put a spring on here just so it doesn't get too hot to touch. And it's simple, but it works. Next step is going to be putting a little control arm down here to adjust my draft. And I'll flip this over, that way you can see what I kind of have envisioned. Okay, well, here's my mock-up. I just made it out of cardboard, some duct tape, and a pen. This is just to mock up the shape before I actually have to cut metal. But the idea is I want this piece to cover this draft, and I want it to be at 2 extremes. One would be closed and the other would be fully open. So the hard part was finding where to put that pivot, because depending on where it is determines how much the arm would move. Once I found that out, I welded a little bolt right here. So now that I have that pivot point, I popped a hole in my cardboard and I was able to test this out to make sure it works the way I want it to. So now all I need to do, pull this pen off, is cut a piece of flat stock this shape, drill a hole in it, and attach a handle that'll stick out this end here, just something to be able to control that vent. I'll get that done and I'll show you what it looks like finished. Well, I finished cutting out and welding up that lever, and that would be all the way open and all the way closed. And let me stand it up so you can see what it looks like. I put a spring on this bolt as well, just so it doesn't get too hot to touch. But that's all the way open, and that's all the way closed. So let's move on to the next step. So the next step is we're gonna have to drill a hole in the side of this so that we have a way to get the oil into the furnace. And I think what I'm gonna use is, I've got a whole bunch of black pipe, steel pipe laying around. This is just a coupler for 2 pipes. What I'm thinking about doing is making just big enough a hole here I can weld one of these in, and that'll allow me to screw both connections from the outside as well as the pipe on the inside. And that way, if I need to take it apart to move it or to clean something, everything's threaded together. There's nothing permanent as far as the plumbing goes. So let me get this drilled out. We'll make sure this fits nice and snug, and then I'll just tack it into place. Okay, well, I've got that connection, the join, go through the side of the tank, and it's all tack welded in. And that gives us a place for the oil to feed in. And it comes in through this 4-inch piece of pipe, and then we'll drip down into our little burn pot down here. Now I'm gonna have to come up with a fuel tank to hold the oil that I can regulate, that will feed the oil in. And once we come up with that, it's pretty much finished. So now we got to figure out how to do that. So I think the next thing I'm going to work on is I have to have a pipe coming out of here that comes up to our oil supply, and I'm going to use this old propane tank as our oil tank. That's going to be kind of our fuel tank. That'll be sitting here, and it'll be gravity fed down to the burn chamber. So let's get started by hacking up this old propane tank, and I'll show you the safe way to do that. Okay, well, first you want to make sure your bottle's empty. You could do that just by opening the valve and making sure that it's unplugged, and hear if it's hissing at all. You can also shake it and feel if there's any kind of a liquid in here. If you think it's empty, the first thing we'll do is I'm going to start by cutting this handle off. Once this is off, I'll be able to access the valve a little easier, and we'll get a wrench on that and take that off to make sure that there's nothing left in this bottle. Okay, now that I've got the top cut off the bottle, like I said before, you want to make sure there's no plugs in the valve, and open it up and make sure you don't hear anything coming out of here. You also can kind of give it a little sniff test, make sure you don't smell any propane coming out of here. I know this is a dead bottle, but go through those, get yourself a nice big wrench. Okay. Pop this off. Usually they don't come off this easy. I probably have opened this bottle already. There's wrench marks on here. So open it up. You'll be sure if it's empty at this point. And then the other thing that you're going to want to do is fill this, use a garden hose or watering can, fill this up with water all the way to the top. And that way, if there's any gases or anything left in here, all those gases will get pushed up by the water, and we'll know that there's nothing left in the tank. Then you can dump all the water back out again, and then you can cut and drill and weld on this and not have to worry about it sparking any gases that were left in the bottle. So I think the first thing that we're going to need to do is drill a hole in it so that I can I'm going to use a brass garden tap, but I'm going to use this a 1-inch pipe coupler, kind of the same thing that we used on the stove. Drill a hole in the side, weld this in, and that'll be our receiver so that I can screw a faucet on there. And that'll give us a little control as far as how much oil is coming out. We can set the drip at that point. I'm going to leave this up here. What I may do is take this valve, cut off any extra pieces that I don't need, and I'll have to plug up a little hole, but I'll take like a carriage bolt maybe and just stick it in there. I'm going to keep this as a cap. This little hole here is big enough to fill it with oil. I can stick a funnel in here, pour in my used oil to fill up the bottle, and then I'll take this and just use it as a cap to seal it back up again. So first things first, let me get drilling, and then we'll look at welding this little receiver in the hole. Well, I got that hole drilled out, and then I sanded around it so I have a clean surface to weld against, and I cleaned off that black pipe. I don't know what it is they put on that gas line pipe. It's got some kind of like a tarry kind of enamel paint, but once I got all that cleaned up, this is good for welding. It's mild steel. So I'm going to insert this into the hole. We'll get it tacked in, and then I'm going to have to seal all the way around it because we don't want our oil leaking out. But once I have that done, I'm going to hack up that valve that was up here, and we'll make a plug for the top of the tank. Well, to get you caught up on a few little things that I've done, we added this piece here with an elbow, and I put a funnel on the top. The funnel's made out of aluminum, so I couldn't weld that on there. So I used like a JB weld just to hold the funnel in place. Another thing I did too is for the pipe that's on the inside here, I felt kind of uncomfortable with that being wide open. So I just welded a little plate across the end of the pipe and cut a little notch at the very bottom of it. Once I knew it was screwed in nice and tight so I could get the position correct, I cut a little notch in the bottom of it. That is going to allow the oil just to drip from the bottom of this pipe without necessarily having that whole pipe wide open. I don't think flame would travel up the pipe, but just as a safety feature, I did it anyway. And then we got that coupler welded into the hole of our propane bottle here, and I screwed in a little faucet tap, and that's going to allow me to adjust how much oil comes out. And we took that valve that was on the top and hacked it all up. And I put a carriage bolt in there to seal up the hole, and that gives me a little plug just to close up the top of the bottle. That'll be my fill hole where I fill it with oil. But I wanted something to cap it so I didn't end up with a bunch of dead bugs floating around in here or a mouse climbing in. So I needed something to close up the top of the bottle. So the next step is going to be to put 3 legs on this bottle that hold it at about this height. That way it's always at the right height for the stove, whether it's sitting on something flat or if it's not quite flat. 3 legs is always going to make sure that I have a nice solid base for this. Once that's done, we get to try it out. I'm going to do that outside someplace because we need to burn this outside paint off this tank before we can paint it with a high temp paint. But let's get the legs put on this bottle. We'll make sure everything lines up correctly, and then it'll be time to fill this up with oil and give it a shot. Well, it's finally looking like something. I got the legs welded onto the tank, so it holds it at just the right height. It's just under the lip of this funnel here. And the idea is if while this is dripping into the system, it's a little bit windy or the drip wanders a little bit, it'll stay within this funnel. At this point, it's really pretty ugly to look at. It could use a coat of paint, but I'm going to test everything first because I can't paint this until I burn off the original paint that's on it and these labels and all that. Hopefully this thing gets hot enough that the paint burns off and I can just do a quick wire brush to clean it before I spray it with high temp paint. This piece here doesn't need high temp paint at all, as long as I use like a Rust-Oleum or something just to keep it from getting any more rusty than the pieces that I used to create it. I'll clean up a lot of this rust and then we'll prime and paint this as well just to make everything look decent. But before we do any of that, it's time to test this out. So we'll get some oil in the tank and we'll fire this thing up and see what happens. Okay, one of the first things we need to do is open up the top of our oil tank. That way we have a steady flow of oil. And one more thing, I attached a piece of brake line to my plug here. That way I have a little makeshift dipstick. That way I can see how much oil is in my tank. So I'm just going to unscrew this and kind of set it off to the side here, so that way this can breathe and let the oil out. And the next thing I'm going to do is open this tap and just set this to a drip. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is dip our paper in the diesel. I'm going to throw that in there, pour a little diesel on top, and then I'm going to use my torch here Okay, now I'm going to open the draft that we created. And I'm going to close the door. Not sure if you can see this, but we've got a little bit of smoke coming out of the chimney, and that's because our system hasn't gotten hot yet. Once it gets real hot and the oil starts burning at temperature, this should almost be smoke free. Okay, it looks like it's going pretty good right now. I can hear it and I can feel the heat pouring off of this thing right now. But once I get a gasket around the door and I seal up all of the holes on this thing, with the exception of the draft at the bottom, it's going to burn a lot hotter and a lot more efficient. I still wish I had a window so you could see what's going on, but what I'll try to do is open the door real fast and we can see what's going on in there. As soon as I open the door though, it's going to break that draft and the flames are going to die down. So I'll see if this even works to show you what's happening. Not sure if you can see that, but that's the oil boiling off and burning. Let me close this. And also some of the smoke is probably coming from the paint that's on the propane bottle and also just anything else that may be inside this tank here. You could really start to see the discoloration now. Everything used to be this baby blue, and you can see where the hot spots are, right at the top, right around like the belt line around the stove. That's where the majority of the heat is, and you can see it in the discoloration of the paint. It's been about maybe 5 minutes so far, and like I said, I'm going to give it maybe a half an hour or an hour to burn, and I think at that point the label and most of this paint will just wipe right off. Of course I'm going to wait for it to cool down before I even try that though. But so far it's a success. Like I said, I would do the door differently, and I would put a window so I can really watch what's going on. I can see my drip of oil here, but I can't really see what's going on over here, and I think that's fairly important to watch what's happening inside. Well, I'm going to say this experiment is a success. The stove is putting out a ton of heat. I ended up putting fireboard behind the chimney here because it is just getting really hot. I think what I would have to do is extend the stovepipe to get this further away from any walls, and also maybe go with a slightly bigger insulated stovepipe. Right now I'm just using a 4-inch. Also would like to have that window so I can see what's going on, but this is working really good, and it's not necessarily that I needed another stove, but I want to show that how you have things laying around like an old pressure tank, and some stovepipe and a few other pieces that you can make stoves, and you can make other things to help you out in times of need. This is working great, and whether you do your own oil changes or even whether or not you fry your own foods, if you go to any restaurant or fast food place or even automotive places, most of those places will give away their waste oil because they have to pay to have that removed. And that's just free fuel. And for anybody who asked why I did the drip system the way I did, kind of separate and not connected to the stove, the whole idea is this is meant to be mobile. I wanted to keep the pieces separate so I can carry them around without breaking my back trying to lift all that weight. And also I wanted to see that drip. I want to see how much oil is going into the system, because that's really how I'm gauging how much fuel is going to the inside. Having a window would be able to help, but as it is now I have to open the door and just make sure I'm not filling that bowl too high. I don't want too much oil in this. Just enough to keep it going, and a little bit at the bottom. I don't know if you can hear it. It kind of sounds like a fryolator. I don't know if the mic is picking that up. That's the oil in here is boiling hot right now, and it's flashing. Sort of like if you have you're frying something on the stove and a little bit of oil splashes out of the pan and ignites and you end up with an oil fire. This is a controlled oil fire. That's really all we're doing here. So it's not rocket science, it's just a little bit of know-how and using pieces and parts. So, you know, if you haven't tried something like this, or you haven't tried making one of these, I urge you give it a shot. I'm gonna open the door, we'll see what it's doing on the inside, and then we'll come back after this is cooled down. I've cleaned it off and made it look pretty, and I'll give you one last view. Okay, I'm not sure how well this is gonna translate, how well you can see this, but all those little ports that we drilled into that propane bottle, you can almost see the streams of fire pouring out of those. And that's the gases burning as well as the oil. And like I said, once all the paint and everything in here burns out, we'll have a much cleaner burn. Right now, there's a little bit of smoke. Most of that is burning paint. You could smell it. It's not so much the oil at this point burning, but there's still some oil smoke. Well, it didn't take long for everything to cool down. It's still April here on the East Coast, so it's kind of chilly. After this cooled down, I gave everything a good scrub, got it all cleaned up, painted our little oil tank with high temp paint, just a good Rust-Oleum, and I painted our stove with stove paint, so it's a very high temperature. Looks a lot nicer. There are a few labels down at the bottom where it doesn't get hot, letting me know what is open and what's closed for the draft, because I won't remember. Anyway, this was a fun little project, and like a lot of the videos we do, it's not necessarily that we needed another stove. We're just trying to show people how to become more self-sufficient, more self-reliant, and less reliant on, you know, the system that's been put into place that could break down at any time. So knowing these things could help you. They do help keep me creative. Working on projects like this always gets my mind working so that I can think of the next thing to put together for a video. If there's anything that you'd like to see, make sure to put it down in the comments. If there's anything you want to share about waste oil stoves, waste oil burners, make sure to comment on those as well. If you think somebody you know might like our videos, make sure to share. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.